March 17, 1944, and the name on the flight roster was Second Lieutenant Caleb Warren, a farm-born rookie from a forgotten Midwest town, and the men in the briefing room laughed before he ever spoke, because he had the accent of a cornfield and the posture of someone who still looked surprised to be wearing a flight jacket. And in a war that worshipped aces and aristocrats, a small-town pilot flying a battered P-47 Thunderbolt looked like a punchline waiting to happen. The men in the briefing room laughed before he ever spoke, because he had the accent of a cornfield and the posture of someone who still looked surprised to be wearing a flight jacket. And in a war that worshipped aces and aristocrats, a small-town rookie flying a battered P-47 Thunderbolt looked like a punchline waiting to happen. But before we go any further, if you enjoy true aviation stories where skill beats numbers and courage beats reputation, subscribe to the channel now, because stories like this disappear into history unless we keep telling them. And on that cold morning in early 1944, nobody believed the boy from nowhere would be remembered at all. Least of all him, because he wasn't chasing glory. He was just trying to survive another mission. Another escort run over hostile territory where the sky itself seemed to belong to the enemy. And the irony is that the P-47 he was assigned was already known among veterans as a flying anvil, too heavy, too clumsy, too slow to dance with the sleek German fighters that waited across the Rhine, and that reputation followed him like a curse as he walked to the aircraft. Hearing whispers that he'd never last a month, that the Thunderbolt was a death sentence in inexperienced hands, that only fools trusted brute force over finesse. But war has a way of punishing assumptions, and the men who mocked him didn't know that the very flaws they laughed at were about to become weapons, because this rookie pilot, raised on machinery that broke down in the middle of harvest and had to be fixed with whatever was on hand, understood something most of them didn't, that survival wasn't about elegance, it was about knowing exactly how far you could push something before it shattered. And the P-47, scarred and overworked as it was, had more left in it than anyone guessed, including the enemy who would soon regret underestimating both machine and man, as the mission began like dozens before it. Engines roaring, the runway blurring beneath heavy wheels, the Thunderbolt clawing its way into the sky with the stubbornness of a tractor pulling free from mud. And already the radio chatter told a familiar story. Escorts stretched thin, enemy interceptors reported ahead. A formation that would soon be tested. And when the first silhouettes appeared, dark crosses against the sun, the veterans tightened up while the rookie felt his mouth go dry, because it's one thing to train for combat and another to see it forming in front of you. The sky suddenly crowded with intent, and when the call came that enemy fighters were massing, more than expected, the tone shifted, because this wasn't going to be a routine skirmish, it was going to be a numbers game, and numbers favored the Luftwaffe that day, 14 fighters converging like sharks sensing blood. And somewhere in that tightening spiral of fear and adrenaline, the rookie made a decision that would define everything that followed, not a heroic vow or a dramatic speech, just a quiet resolve. That he would not fly the Thunderbolt the way everyone said it should be flown, because doctrine is written by survivors, but survival often belongs to those willing to break it. And as the enemy dove, fast and confident, expecting the usual response, defensive turns, frantic radio calls, a slow bleeding retreat, the rookie did something that made his own wingman shout in disbelief. He pushed the nose down, not to run, not to dive away, but to build speed straight into the attack, using the Thunderbolt's weight like a falling hammer, and in that instant the aircraft transformed, the same mass that made it clumsy in a turn now made it unstoppable in a dive, and the airframe held, screaming but obedient, as the speed needle crept into territory others feared to touch, and the German pilots, trained to exploit lighter, more agile machines, suddenly found their assumptions collapsing. Because the American didn't break off, didn't scatter, didn't behave like a hunted animal, he came straight through them, guns blazing, and the first enemy fighter never even knew what hit him. The Thunderbolt flashing past in a blur of metal and fire, and when the rookie pulled up hard, blacking out at the edges of his vision, the aircraft answered again, wings holding, engine roaring, and that was the moment the laughter in the briefing room died, replaced by something far more dangerous for the enemy, uncertainty. Because one pilot flying like this could disrupt an entire formation, and as the sky dissolved into chaos, radios crackled with confusion on both sides, commands overlapping, warnings shouted too late, and the rookie, heart hammering, realized he had found the edge, that narrow band where fear sharpened into focus, where instinct and machine became one, and he began to work the Thunderbolt not as a dancer but as a brawler, diving, climbing, diving again, forcing enemies to commit, then punishing them for it, each pass a gamble measured in fractions of a second, and the German pilots, used to dictating the fight, now found themselves reacting, trying to anticipate a pattern that didn't exist because the rookie wasn't following a script. He was improvising, using terrain, clouds, speed, anything he could grab from the chaos, and somewhere below, flak burst uselessly, too slow, too scattered, because the fight had dropped lower than expected. A deliberate choice that added another layer of risk, but also another layer of protection, and the Thunderbolt, scarred but stubborn, absorbed punishment that would have shredded lighter planes, its armor earning its keep, and with every surviving second the rookie's confidence grew, not arrogance, but a fierce clarity that this was possible. That numbers didn't automatically mean defeat, and when one enemy pilot tried to latch onto his tail, confident the heavy American couldn't shake him, the rookie rolled and dove again, pulling the German into a speed trap he couldn't escape, the airframe shaking, control stiffening, until the enemy broke off too late, overshooting into the rookie's guns, and another threat vanished in a flash, and by now the sky was no longer full of hunters but survivors, enemy pilots calling out warnings, orders tightening into panic, because what should have been a clean slaughter had turned into a grinding, unpredictable nightmare, and the rookie, fuel dropping, ammunition dwindling, knew he couldn't keep this up forever, that every second increased the odds against him, but he also knew that backing off too early would surrender the initiative he'd stolen. So he pressed on, not chasing kills but denying angles, breaking formations, turning 14 enemies into isolated individuals, and this is where the story stops being about raw skill and becomes about mindset, because fear never left him, it just stopped being in control, and as the fight reached its breaking point, as radios crackled with desperate calls to disengage, something extraordinary happened. The enemy began to withdraw, not because they were outmatched in numbers, not because they'd lost too many aircraft, but because they could no longer predict the fight, and unpredictability is poison in aerial combat. And as the last silhouettes peeled away, the rookie finally allowed himself to breathe, hands shaking, sweat freezing inside his gloves, the Thunderbolt limping but alive, and he turned for home, unaware that the story of what had just happened would spread faster than he ever could, that the men who laughed would soon fall silent, and that this single engagement was only the beginning, because once a myth is broken, once a so-called death trap proves it can survive the impossible, the war never looks quite the same again. By the time the Thunderbolt crossed back over friendly lines, the fight was already mutating into rumor, because aerial combat has a way of growing teeth the moment it's retold, and the veterans who had watched the engagement from a distance knew they had just seen something that didn't fit the manuals, something that felt wrong in the way only truth can, and while mechanics rushed toward the scarred P-47 as it rolled to a stop, counting holes, touching the metal like medics checking a wounded body, Caleb Warren sat frozen in the cockpit for several seconds longer than necessary, because the adrenaline hadn't released him yet, and when he finally climbed down, legs unsteady, he didn't raise his arms or grin. He just nodded once, as if acknowledging a debt paid, and walked away while behind him someone finally said out loud what everyone was thinking. That plane should not be in one piece, and that pilot should not be alive. And within hours the debriefing room felt different than it had that morning, quieter, heavier, because laughter had consequences now, and the officers wanted details, exact details, speeds, angles, altitudes, what he did and why. But Caleb struggled to explain it in the language they wanted, because he hadn't followed a checklist. He had followed pressure, instinct, the same logic that told you when an engine was about to fail or when a field would bog down a tractor, and the more he talked the more some of them frowned, because what he described sounded reckless, almost suicidal, and yet the evidence was sitting on the airfield outside. A Thunderbolt that had outlived 14 enemies, and as word spread to other squadrons, reactions split cleanly down the middle, half dismissing it as a fluke, the other half leaning in, hungry, because war rewards anything that works, no matter how ugly, and within days pilots were asking questions they hadn't before about dive limits, about structural tolerances, about how much punishment the P-47 could really take, and this curiosity didn't go unnoticed by the enemy, because the Luftwaffe was also counting losses, also replaying the fight, also struggling to understand why a formation advantage had evaporated, and German intelligence reports began to include a phrase that hadn't appeared often before in reference to Thunderbolts, unpredictable, which was dangerous, because predictability is the skeleton key of air combat, and when you lose it, doctrine starts to rot, and as the weeks passed and missions stacked one on top of another, Caleb's name kept resurfacing, not because he chased attention, but because he kept surviving encounters that should have ended him, each one reinforcing the same lesson, that the Thunderbolt, flown brutally and without apology, could dominate vertical space in a way lighter fighters couldn't match, and this lesson spread informally, whispered on tarmacs, scribbled on kneeboards, tested cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, and with each test the myth of the death trap cracked further, replaced by a new, quieter understanding that the P-47 wasn't meant to dance, it was meant to fall and fall hard, and somewhere in this shift Caleb became a reference point. Not a hero yet, but a proof of concept, the guy who showed it was possible, and that made him a target in ways he didn't fully grasp because the enemy learns too, and on a gray morning not long after, escorting bombers deeper than usual, the radio crackled with a warning that sent a chill through even seasoned pilots. A large enemy response forming ahead, bigger than before, organized, patient, and this time there would be no element of surprise, because the Luftwaffe wasn't underestimating Thunderbolts anymore, they were hunting them deliberately, and when the first enemy fighters appeared, they didn't dive recklessly, they held altitude, forcing a different kind of engagement, one designed to neutralize the Thunderbolt's greatest strength. And for the first time since that initial battle, Caleb felt doubt press in hard, because this wasn't chaos. This was a trap forming, and the veterans recognized it too, voices tightening over the radio, plans dissolving as reality intruded, because numbers again favored the enemy, and the sky ahead looked like a wall. And in that moment Caleb realized something uncomfortable, that the tactic he discovered wasn't a magic key, it was a tool, and tools can be countered. And the only thing more dangerous than a bad tactic is blind faith in a good one, so he adjusted, not abandoning the dive but redefining it, using feints, shallow drops to provoke pursuit without committing fully, testing reactions, mapping the enemy's patience, and what he found was telling. The German pilots wanted him to dive, wanted him fast and low where coordination would break down, and that knowledge became leverage because instead of falling all the way through, he climbed, trading speed for altitude earlier than expected, forcing the enemy to choose between chasing and losing position, and this constant refusal to resolve the fight on anyone else's terms began to fray nerves, because pilots crave closure, a kill, a clean disengagement, something solid, and Caleb denied them that, again and again, stretching the engagement, burning fuel, forcing mistakes, and when one finally came it was small, almost invisible, a single fighter slipping out of formation a fraction too far, and Caleb pounced, not with the reckless plunge of before, but with a controlled dive that preserved options, and the Thunderbolt answered, heavy and sure, and the enemy pilot vanished in a brief, violent exchange that reminded everyone watching that this wasn't theory anymore, it was practice, and the sky fractured again, not into panic this time, but into exhaustion, because prolonged combat drains even the best pilots, and the Luftwaffe, stretched thin, couldn't afford long fights, and as they peeled away one by one, the bombers pressed on, their formation ragged but intact, and when the Thunderbolts finally turned for home, radios filled with a different kind of chatter, not disbelief now, but analysis, pilots comparing notes, debating angles, speeds, how far was too far, and this is how doctrine really changes, not in classrooms, but in arguments between exhausted men who just survived something they weren't supposed to, and Caleb listened more than he spoke, because he knew luck had played a role that survival doesn't equal invincibility, and yet he also knew something else now, that the enemy had shifted from mocking to measuring, and that was progress paid for in blood, and as the campaign ground on, his aircraft accumulated scars like tally marks, each one a reminder that the margin was thin, that the Thunderbolt could forgive much but not everything, and then came the mission that would seal his reputation, not as a survivor, but as a problem the enemy actively tried to solve, a deep penetration escort under clear skies, the kind pilots hated because there was nowhere to hide, and when German fighters appeared this time, they came in waves, coordinated, disciplined, clearly briefed, and for the first time Caleb heard something new on the radio, enemy transmissions breaking through, urgent, clipped, naming his altitude, his direction, tracking him specifically, and that realization hit harder than any flak burst, because anonymity is armor and he had lost it, and as the fight escalated, it became clear the enemy's plan was simple, ignore the others, focus on the Thunderbolt that refused to behave, overwhelm it with attention, force it into a mistake, and for long minutes the sky became a cage, threats converging from every angle, and this was where the story could have ended badly, because even the toughest machine has limits, and even the calmest pilot has a breaking point, and Caleb felt both approaching, engine temperature climbing, arms aching, vision narrowing, and in that crucible, he made the hardest decision of all, to give up the fight on his terms, to dive not to attack, but to escape, straight through a corridor of fire that no sane pilot would choose, trusting the Thunderbolt's armor and speed one last time. And as the aircraft screamed downward, controls vibrating, warning lights flickering, flak bursting too late and too high, he realized that survival itself could be a victory, that denying the enemy satisfaction mattered, and when he finally leveled out miles away, alone, fuel nearly gone, the radio silent, he laughed, not in triumph, but in disbelief, because the small-town pilot everyone had mocked had just forced one of the most experienced air forces in the world to bend its plans around him. And that, more than any kill count, was when the war quietly acknowledged him. After that mission, the squadron stopped treating survival as something accidental and started treating it as something that could be engineered, and this shift did not happen all at once or cleanly, because war resists tidy conclusions, but it began in small, almost invisible ways in how pilots watched the sky before engaging, in how they talked less about kills and more about positioning, energy, exit paths, and this was where Caleb Warren's influence truly deepened, not as a legend yet, but as a pattern others began to recognize and adapt, because the enemy had changed and now so had they, and the Thunderbolt squadrons were no longer content to simply escort and react. They began to shape fights before they started, using altitude like currency, spending it only when the return justified the risk, and Caleb, despite his growing reputation, remained oddly detached from the mythology forming around him, because every mission reinforced the same uncomfortable truth, that none of this made him safe, that every success only increased the odds that the next engagement would be deliberately designed to kill him, and this awareness sharpened him in ways training never could. Because he stopped thinking of the enemy as faceless opponents and started thinking of them as planners, professionals who studied patterns the same way he did, and when intelligence briefings started including warnings that German pilots were being briefed specifically on Thunderbolt dive behavior, on structural limits, on recovery windows, the implication was clear: the enemy was no longer reacting, they were anticipating, and anticipation is lethal, and this realization coincided with a brutal stretch of operations where losses mounted on both sides, where weather turned missions into endurance tests before combat even began, where engines failed over enemy territory and parachutes became gambles, and through all of this Caleb kept flying, not because he was fearless, but because he understood something that many never fully articulate, that fear does not vanish with experience, it just becomes more precise, more informative, and on a morning thick with low cloud and promise of icing, the squadron was tasked with escorting bombers toward a rail hub that German defenses had turned into a fortress, layered flak, overlapping fighter cover, the kind of target planners loved and pilots hated, and as they climbed through the cloud deck, radios hissed with static and unease, because visibility was already compromised, and when they broke out into clear air, the sky above was wrong, too empty, a sign every pilot recognized as danger delayed, not danger avoided, and Caleb felt it before the first warning came, a tightening in the chest that had nothing to do with altitude, and when enemy fighters finally appeared, they did not come screaming out of the sun as expected. They emerged from the cloud layers below and to the side, perfectly placed, forcing immediate decisions without clean options, and this was the enemy's answer to unpredictability, constraint, limiting space until even improvisation had nowhere to breathe, and the fight that followed was unlike any before, not chaotic, not panicked, but methodical, brutal in its patience, with German pilots refusing to overcommit, nibbling at the formation, testing reactions, forcing Thunderbolts to burn altitude without reward, and Caleb recognized the trap forming, because he had helped inspire it, and for the first time the question was not how to attack, but how to avoid being slowly dismantled, and as bombers pressed on under fire, the escorts stretched thinner, each engagement costing energy that could not be easily regained under cloud cover, and the Thunderbolt's strengths began to erode, not because they had vanished, but because the environment no longer favored them, and this is where Caleb made a choice that would later be debated endlessly, because instead of staying with the main escort group, he deliberately peeled away with two others, creating a tempting vulnerability that immediately drew enemy attention, and over the radio someone questioned the move sharply, but Caleb did not answer because there was no time to explain that this was bait, that by presenting a smaller, seemingly isolated element, he could force the Germans to choose between exploiting it or continuing their slow suffocation of the bombers, and the enemy chose, predictably, to strike, committing more fighters than expected, and in doing so they revealed something vital. Their coordination relied on maintaining visual contact through the cloud layers, and when Caleb dove shallow and fast into a cloud bank, not to escape but to reposition, He pulled part of the enemy formation with him into a space where discipline fractured into instinct, and inside that white chaos, doctrine died because cloud combat strips away distance, compresses time, and turns every second into a reflex test. And this was where Caleb's rural instincts returned, the ability to feel machinery through vibration, to judge speed without instruments, to react to subtle changes in sound, and when aircraft burst out of the cloud unexpectedly, crossing paths at lethal closure rates, it was Caleb who fired first, not because he was quicker, but because he was already aligned for the possibility, and the fight exploded again, this time fragmented, unpredictable in a way that favored the Thunderbolt's durability. And yet the cost was high because Flak, blind and indifferent, tore through the cloud layer and one of Caleb's wingmen went down. A sudden absence that left no time for grief, only anger, and anger is dangerous in the air, because it narrows focus. And Caleb felt it tugging at him, urging pursuit, urging reckless dives, and he fought it as hard as any enemy pilot, because he knew this was what the Germans wanted, an emotional mistake, and instead he did something colder, more calculating. He disengaged again, dragging the fight horizontally rather than vertically, forcing turns that bled speed from lighter aircraft while the Thunderbolt's momentum carried it through, and this was not elegant, it was grinding, exhausting, and it pushed both man and machine toward limits rarely tested, and as fuel warnings crept closer, as ammunition counts dropped into uncomfortable territory, the bombers finally turned for home, their objective damaged but not destroyed, and now the priority shifted to survival, and the Germans pressed harder, sensing opportunity, and for long minutes the sky became a relentless sequence of threats, each narrowly avoided, each costing something, altitude, speed, composure, and when Caleb finally saw friendly lines ahead, he understood that this had not been a victory in any simple sense, that losses on both sides had been real, that no clean narrative would capture the truth, and when he landed, silence followed him again. But this time it was different, heavier, because the men who watched him climb down understood that they were not watching a lucky rookie anymore. They were watching someone who had forced the war itself to adapt, and adaptation is expensive, and over the following weeks, intelligence reports confirmed what many suspected: German pilots were being instructed to avoid extended vertical engagements with Thunderbolts, to conserve altitude, to refuse bait, which on paper sounded sensible, but in practice ceded initiative, because avoiding a fight still shapes it. And this created a strange new equilibrium where neither side fully controlled the sky, where every engagement felt provisional, temporary, and exhausting, and Caleb's role in this was never officially acknowledged with grand speeches or medals right away. Because institutions move slowly, but among pilots his name had become shorthand, a warning and an example, and yet for him, the weight of it grew heavier, because every mission now carried the knowledge that others were watching, learning, copying, and that meant mistakes would echo far beyond him, and this burden changed how he flew, making him more conservative in some moments, more daring in others, because leadership in combat is often invisible, measured not in orders given but in habits adopted. And the war rolled on, indifferent to individual stories, chewing through men and machines alike, but somewhere in that vast machinery, a single truth had been carved out, that a so-called death trap could become a predator, that a small-town pilot could bend a battle without ever winning it outright, and that survival itself could be a form of dominance. And as the season turned and the front shifted, Caleb prepared for what he sensed would be the defining test, the moment when the enemy would stop probing and commit fully to erasing the anomaly he represented, because war tolerates disruption only briefly before it tries to eliminate it. And when that moment came, it would not be dramatic at first, it would arrive disguised as another routine mission, another line on a briefing board, and the sky would look ordinary right up until it wasn't. What followed the crash was not rest or relief but a strange, suspended silence, because survival in war often creates a vacuum where certainty used to live. And as Caleb Warren lay in a field hospital with the smell of antiseptic replacing oil and cordite, the war continued without pausing to acknowledge what had almost happened. Bombers still flew, pilots still failed to return, and somewhere above the clouds the Luftwaffe continued adjusting its methods. And this was the cruelest truth of all, that even near death did not make you special for very long. And yet when Caleb was cleared to walk, then to fly again, the atmosphere around him had changed in a way he could not ignore, because he was no longer just a pilot. Returning from injury, he was a variable the enemy had actively tried to remove, and variables in war are dangerous things, unpredictable, disruptive, expensive, and the intelligence summaries made that clear without ever saying his name out loud, noting increased German emphasis on isolating Thunderbolt elements, on forcing escorts into prolonged low-altitude engagements, on avoiding vertical chases unless conditions were perfect. And these were not abstract notes anymore, they were reflections of lessons paid for in metal and blood. And Caleb understood with a kind of grim acceptance that his survival had not ended the story, it had escalated it. Because the enemy now knew exactly how hard the Thunderbolt could be pushed and exactly how far he was willing to go, and that knowledge narrowed the space he could operate in. And when he returned to the flight line, limping slightly, helmet under his arm, the looks he received were no longer amused or skeptical. They were searching, as if others were trying to read the future in him. And this weight followed him into the cockpit on his first mission back. A shorter escort this time, closer to friendly lines, officially a cautious reintroduction, unofficially a test, because everyone wanted to see whether the edge was still there. And as engines roared and the formation climbed, Caleb felt the old tension return, but layered now with something heavier, responsibility sharpened by the knowledge that mistakes would not be his alone. And when enemy fighters appeared, fewer than before but positioned with intent, he resisted the urge to immediately assert himself, to dive and disrupt as he once would have, because that would have confirmed expectations on both sides, and instead he held position, forcing the Germans to reveal their plan first, and they did, cautiously, probing the formation, trying to provoke a response, and when none came, the fight took on a strange, coiled quality, like two opponents, circling, each aware that the first decisive move would carry disproportionate risk. And this standoff was broken not by aggression but by patience, because the enemy, unwilling to waste fuel and altitude without payoff, eventually committed a small element forward, and Caleb seized that moment, not with speed but with geometry, positioning his Thunderbolt to cut off retreat rather than chase, forcing the German pilot to choose between breaking formation or entering a turning fight he could not win. And when the enemy chose wrong, the result was swift and brutal, and the message was clear to everyone watching. This was no longer about spectacular dives or reckless courage, it was about control, and the rest of the engagement dissolved quickly after that, the Germans disengaging with minimal losses but without achieving anything, and this pattern repeated over subsequent missions, not always with kills, often without any at all, but always with the same result, the enemy failing to impose their will. And this frustrated them deeply, because wars are not won by dramatic victories alone but by accumulated frustration, by forcing the opponent to expend effort without return, and Caleb's presence did exactly that. And as weeks passed, something subtle but significant occurred. Luftwaffe appearances against Thunderbolt-escorted formations decreased, not vanished but thinned, redirected toward supposedly easier targets. And this shift saved lives in ways no single victory ever could, and yet this success carried a personal cost, because the more effective Caleb became at shaping engagements without spectacle, the less visible his impact was to those outside the cockpit, and this invisibility gnawed at him during quiet moments, not because he needed praise, but because he knew how easily such contributions could be forgotten, folded into statistics and footnotes. And the war offered no reassurance, because just as patterns stabilize, they break, and the break came on a day when weather grounded most units, leaving only a handful of squadrons airborne, stretched thin by necessity. And Caleb's flight was among them, tasked with covering a reduced bomber element pushing through under marginal conditions. And this time the enemy returned in force, sensing opportunity, numbers once again tilting against the escorts, and as cloud layers compressed the battle space, the fight became chaotic in a way that erased careful planning, and Caleb found himself once more in a close, grinding engagement, Thunderbolt shuddering, visibility collapsing, and for a moment it felt like history repeating itself, like the war attempting to reclaim a debt it had not collected earlier. And this time there was no dramatic escape through flak, no clean disengagement, only endurance, minute after minute of defensive flying, of denying firing solutions, of trusting the aircraft to absorb punishment without asking it to perform miracles. And when the bombers finally broke through and turned back, the escorts were scattered, low on fuel, damaged, and Caleb's Thunderbolt bore fresh scars. But it flew, stubbornly, faithfully, and when he landed, safely this time, there was no applause, no stunned silence, only weary nods, because survival had become normalized. And in that normalization lay the real victory, because the so-called deathtrap had become a workhorse of denial, and the small-town pilot who once drew laughter had become a constant pressure the enemy could never fully resolve. And this is the cruel, anticlimactic truth of air war, that its most decisive figures are often those who prevent outcomes rather than create them. And as Caleb shut down the engine and climbed from the cockpit, He understood that whatever final test awaited him would not be about proving anything anymore. It would be about whether endurance itself could outlast a war that showed no sign of caring who deserved to survive it. The final mission came without ceremony, because by that point nothing in the war felt ceremonial anymore, only necessary, and when Caleb Warren stood in the briefing room that morning, the board showed a route that cut deeper than usual, not dramatically so, just enough to raise quiet concern, because the enemy defenses in that sector had been reorganized, reinforced, and intelligence suggested that whatever remained of the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots were being concentrated there. Not to dominate the sky, but to contest it one last time, and this framing mattered, because contesting the sky is different from controlling it. It is an admission that dominance is no longer guaranteed, and as the mission unfolded, as engines climbed and formations settled into their long, patient march, Caleb felt a strange calm settle over him. Not confidence, not bravado, but a sense of closure, because the war had already taken what it could from him without killing him, and whatever happened next would not change what he had learned. And when enemy fighters appeared, fewer than in earlier months but flown with an intensity that betrayed their desperation, the engagement that followed was neither spectacular nor chaotic. It was efficient, almost restrained, with both sides making careful choices, breaking off when angles vanished, refusing unnecessary risks, and this restraint was itself a sign of how much the war had changed, because early in the campaign such caution would have been unthinkable, and yet here it was, shaping every move, and Caleb flew as he always had in recent months, denying opportunities, conserving energy, protecting bombers not by chasing enemies away but by occupying space they wanted. And when a German pilot finally committed to a head-on pass, a move born more of frustration than strategy, the exchange was brief and decisive, the enemy breaking away trailing smoke, and that was the closest Caleb came to violence that day. And as the bombers reached their target and turned for home, resistance faded, not because the enemy lacked courage, but because they lacked options, and when the Thunderbolts crossed back over friendly lines intact, the mission was logged as a success without qualifiers, no asterisks, no footnotes, and Caleb landed with fuel to spare, an increasingly rare luxury, and as he shut down the engine for what he did not yet know would be the last time in combat, he felt neither triumph nor relief, only a quiet awareness that this chapter had ended without asking for permission. And in the days that followed, the front shifted, priorities changed, and Caleb was rotated away from combat operations, not because he was broken, but because the war had moved on, and this was perhaps the strangest ending of all, that after bending engagements and shaping enemy behavior, he left not in flames or glory, but in silence. And years later, when historians looked back at the air war, they would count aces and victories, they would chart production numbers and sortie rates, and somewhere in those numbers they would miss what mattered most, that dominance is not always achieved by those who destroy the most, but by those who force the enemy to hesitate, to adapt, to spend effort without reward. And Caleb Warren's name would not appear prominently in textbooks, but the Thunderbolt's reputation would, transformed from deathtrap to guardian, from blunt instrument to strategic shield, and that transformation did not happen because of a single miracle or a single battle. It happened because one small-town pilot refused to fly the way he was told he should, and in doing so, taught both sides of the war a lesson they could not unlearn, that survival itself can be an act of defiance, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that end quietly, with an engine cooling on a runway, a pilot walking away, and the sky at last just sky again.